Hi guys, and welcome to Ancestral Recall. This is a magic show about the history of Magic the Gathering. I'm your host, Eli Kaplan. Today, we're continuing our examination of 1999's Urza's Legacy, the second set in Saga block and part of the most powerful block in Magic's history. Last show, we looked at the story, the mechanics, and some of the key cycles. Today, we're going to go through the 5 colors and artifacts to point out the many fun and exciting cards that populated this set. We'll look at the set's most interesting and innovative cards, briefly discuss the expensive cards, and give the set its final verdict. Without further ado, let's go! In cubes with major focuses on auras, you're going to want to include Devout Harpist. For a single white mana, this achingly beautiful Rebecca Guay illustrated card can destroy auras at will. Now, if this card had been printed in Theros block, they'd probably make it a 1-2 and have it cost 3 or 4 mana. But here, the Harpist is as cheap as white spells get. It's a very useful cube tool. Expendable Troops, 1W, is what I want in the Grizzly Bear. 2 power, and it has a relevant ability in the mid and late game. This may make board combat's math intense, but the fact that you have to sacrifice it keeps it from being too frustrating. And as I mentioned last episode, like the Carrier Cycle, this card was much more powerful under 6th edition rules, able to block and kill a 4 toughness attacker when damage went on the sack. Now, even under the current rules, this is still a worthy card in many cubes, and soldier-themed casual decks should not forget about it. Karmic Guide for 3WW is a rarity, a white creature that lets you reanimate other creatures. And unlike Invasion's Rhea Dawnbringer, Karmic Guide doesn't cost an insane amount of mana. Many EDH players have combined Karmic Guide with RevelArc for great obnoxiousness. Now, I personally don't approve of that sort of thing in casual play because it's too abusable for my taste, but it exists nonetheless. And the reason that Karmic Guide is such a sought-after card, despite a recent Commander reprint, is that, you can reanimate the Reanimator. So there are nigh endless combos that work with this. Mother of Runes is a staple in so many cubes. Ma Runes looks after your creatures, giving them protection when necessary, even if most of the time she sits back and does nothing. It's the cautious, loving type of inaction, waiting to get into her helicopter to fly to the rescue. This is one of White's very best 1-drops and is a casual mainstay. Now, the woman depicted in the original art is Beth Morsand, one of Wizards' early rules gurus and a regular contributor to the Duelist magazine. Commander players will tell you that Fracturing Gust is the format's best mass removal spell for artifacts and enchantments, since it comes tacked on with a Life Gain Rider. But the green component locks it out of many deck builders' hands. Purity is the next best alternative, with the same destruction but no additional life gain. And if you're willing to wait a bit and want a more easily recurred version, then Weatherlight Serenity is another option. Serenity now. Except it's never Serenity now, it's Serenity on your next upkeep. But we'll get to Mirage block after Saga block, so just be patient, please. Blue has some solid, amazing cards in Urza's Legacy. Last episode I talked about the free spells such as Frantic Search, Snap, and Cloud of Fairies, but I didn't mention the granddaddy of all free spells, Palinchron. Palinchron costs 5 UU, but gives you back 7 untapped lands. Now, so what? That's like Great Whale, but with flying instead of an additional point of power. What is the advantage here? Oh, but you can bounce Palinchron back to your hand at will. Now that pushes Palinchron over the top. And if you can get 5 more mana extra out of those lands you're untapping, with cards like Gauntlet of Power, or Mana Flare, or Heartbeat of Spring, or even High Tide, then Palinchron is a license to go infinite mana. In Limited, Palinchron's a slow and unspectacular big blue finisher, as I experienced at the Urza's Legacy pre-release. But in Constructed, this was a combo player's dream card. If you're looking for a simple, no-nonsense blue card draw source and aren't worried about creatures being fragile, Archivist for 2 UU is clean and effective. 4 mana, 1 turn, and then this card will just tap for cards every turn after that. Most EDH and casual players prefer to pay 1 mana upfront for a faster and more synergistic version with Kamigawa's Azami, Lady of Scrolls, but Archivist was the very first creature to just straight up let you tap it to draw with no additional cost. Normally, blue doesn't get to hose enchantments, but just as Antiquity's Energy Flux for 2U hosts artifacts by tacking on a 2-mana upkeep cost to them, so does Aura Flux hose enchantments with the same 2-mana tax for the same cost. Now, mind you, this affects all enchantments, not just auras, or what dinosaurs like me used to call local enchantments. The name's unfortunate because newer players would get really confused if Wizards reprinted it and didn't just affect auras. Them's the breaks. Blue normally isn't the color you usually think of when discussing cute, cuddly creatures, but Urza's Legacy was the first set to feature Beebles. What are Beebles? What do they eat? Why do they look like that? You'd have to ask Jeff Maricola, the artist. These whimsical goofballs are tied to magical effects in some way, making them slip through artifact or enchantment holders. And some Vorthoses hate these creatures with a passion, saying, "My game's too serious for this." Wizards only ever printed 2 in black border, and art-focused players either love them or hate them. But Beebles do show up in a few other cards' art. I can tell you that when players draft cubes and the Beebles are in one of the packs, you can see it in their faces. They either light up and smile, or cross their face in confusion. Oh, how cute. This may be tonal dissonance for some people. Exactly what was WotC thinking? Well, I'm glad Wizards made Beebles, and while I don't expect any more in the future, I'll be very happy if I'm wrong. And if you want to put bouncing Beebles in your cube but just can't handle the art, you can just opt for Mirrodin's Nurok Spy, which is far more typical in terms of magic art. You joyless drones. Yeah, I know that vintage players are going to get ticked off and send angry Blightsteel Colossi after me if I don't talk about Tinker for 2U. Why Mark Rosewater thought at the time that trading life for mana costs to upgrade an artifact to one of your choice was a fair ability is beyond me. This is restricted in vintage and for very just cause. Yuck, yuck, yuck! This is not what I call fun, but there are a whole bunch of people who would disagree with me. So if you want to give Tinker a try, you're more than welcome to. The set's black cards keep delving into Phyrexia. Last show I discussed the Carrier Cycle. Bone Shredder for 2B is another bringer of death, bringing a terror as it hits the table and offering a 1/1 flyer on the next turn if you're willing to pony up an additional 2B. I like the tough decision you have to make on that upkeep, but for decks that have the ability to constantly reanimate, and we are talking about black here, Bone Shredder is much more easy to get into the graveyard and thus reuse than Necrotal. If you're looking for a versatile way to deal with problem creatures, especially tribal decks, Engineer Plague for 2B is a great choice. It's not the first creature type hoser printed, that would be King Suleiman from Arabian Nights. Other early creature type hosers included Tividar's Crusade against Goblins, and Tempest's Extinction, which would let you wipe out any tribe on the table. But Engineer Plague is the first tribal hoser that lets you pick which tribe gets hosed, and also sticks on the table. This saw some constructed sideboard play at the time. Everyone remembers Duress, which first saw print in Urza Saga, but few people remember Ostracize, the creature version which also costs B. With the addition of Planeswalker cards to Magic, this card got a much-needed upgrade to Despise in New Phyrexia, because Planeswalkers, if we have to think about what they're closest to, well, they're creatures. And yet, even with the upgrade, Despise saw very little play. Now, Ostracize works well in cheap tempo decks, but Black didn't have the support at the time to pull it off. Anthony Alonji, longtime multiplayer writer for the Mothership in an era before Commander, coined the term rattlesnake cards. Cards that scared opponents from attacking to you. Just don't come knocking. Well, No Mercy is the classic rattlesnake card. If someone wants to attack you, they're going to do so knowing that they're going to lose their creature 99% of the time. This card is elegant, powerful, and happily is not on the reserved list, but it's had no reprints to date. Come on, Wizards! What's keeping ya? Speaking of obvious multiplayer cards, Subversion is easy, simple, and aggravating. And since it's an enchantment, it's usually a pain to get off the table. Now, there are other cards out there that drain all other players' life, like Kokusho, the Evening Star, but Subversion is the sneaky, less offensive installment plan. Swats! A solid limited card that answers a lot of little problem creatures. Now, I'm astonished that this card only got reprinted once in Onslaught. Like most conditional removal spells with cycling, it feels fine to draw it throughout all stages of the game. In 2016's Creature Stat World, it's lost a ton of value, but it's a late pick in many cubes, and I've always found it a home in all of my cubes. One of the most successful cycling cards in Magic's history is Unearth. Its targeting restriction makes it clearly worse than most reanimation spells, but the 1 mana cost and cycling made it surprisingly popular in Standard. It isn't fancy, but it's a cool creative reanimation spell that thrived in an era where few creatures in Standard broke the 3 mana barrier. The red cards in Urza's Legacy aren't essential to the story. It's just, these are more guys in Shiv working for Urza at the Foundry. They're mostly Viashino, particularly the Viashino Sand Scout and Cutthroat, and they're modifications of the original hit Viashino Sandstalker from Visions. But there's nothing wrong with just mapping out more of the world of Dominaria. One of the classic gag Goblin cards that isn't too bad is Goblin Medics. This is a fun equipment in equipment-heavy cubes that give players ways to tap their creatures for profit. Now, just tapping a creature and having that do a point of damage isn't something we see in red very often either. Medics? Yeah, in red, well, Goblin Medics, they're cool. The Goblin version of the Hippocratic Oath is good flavor text. If you look at some of the most broken cards in Magic's early years, you're going to see a lot of artifacts. And so as soon as Goblin Wielders saw print, it was immediately sought after by Type 1 or Vintage players. The ability to discard powerful artifacts, then trade trash for treasure, spawn new archetypes. In fact, modern players have access to a one-time use of this, Trash for Treasure, a Mirrodin sorcery inspired by this very card. Goblin Welder decks are still around in Vintage and Legacy, and prosper in part because the first time this effect got printed, it was way too cheap. Goblin Welder isn't the most impactful Goblin of Saga block, that would be Goblin Lackey, but it's really close. Shock is a fair card when priced at 2 mana, and good at 1. Now, Parch, for 1R, had the additional rider of doing 4 damage to a blue creature. It was specifically designed to deal with the standard scourge of trade-win rider decks. Control decks that continually bounce permanents. Parch didn't work as well at that task as the developers had hoped, but it helped. Strangely, Parch hasn't been reprinted, but that's in part because the problem with blue normally isn't its creatures. If you want to put a powerful answer to artifacts in your cube or EDH deck, there are few choices better than the Viashino Heretic. 2R for 1/3 isn't great stats, but the ability to repeatedly destroy artifacts, as well as punish the controller by doming them for the damage of the converted mana cost, is utterly brutal. I played this at the Urza's Legacy pre-release, my first pre-release, and it was stellar. For casual constructed, this is an unsubtle tool that may make enemies, but sometimes the direct route is the best route. Green's all about the remaining pristine forest of Yavimaya, and how it reacts to Urza encountering the locals. They remember what happened to Argoth, and bear a grudge. And they bear so much hostility to the Artificer Planeswalker, naming him the Doom of Argoth. Crop rotation. Yeah, this card got restricted in Vintage and banned in Standard quite quickly, because this was a tutor in green that let you get your best land and put it into play. Yes, there's the cost of sacking a land as you play it, but it was worth bearing if the replacement made more than 1 mana. And in an era with lands like Tolarian Academy and Gaia's Cradle, this was a recipe for abuse. In the beginning of the 21st century, in the days when blue wizards roamed the Standard and Extended Earth with hard counters for 2 mana, a green mage didn't have many options. But there was one that I loved, and that few of the Japanese control players around me ever expected. Hidden Gibbons. Yes, a 1 mana enchantment that turned into a 4/4 ape as soon as your opponent plays an instant. I always wanted these sideboard cards to show up on turn 1. This was a reason to play your spells before combat, so that the Gibbons could go online and punish your opponent with 4 damage upside the head. and then hopefully 4 for the next 4 turns. Now, a lot of Japanese players thought that I was playing the game wrong when I had this on the table, but they just didn't expect to see the gibbons. And this era had very few rewards for playing spells pre-combat, but gibbons was one of them. This is a narrow and spiteful card, but this was my narrow and spiteful card. It was also okay against red burn decks. I won a ton of games with this. Aaron Forsyth is the top guy at Wizards R&D, but when he was a pro player, he cemented his individual status with a red-green deck featuring Deranged Hermit. At 5 mana with Echo, the Hermit was expensive, but it was the first army in a card for green. If you play the first one and choose not to pay the Echo cost but follow up with a fresh copy, then those squirrels are still going to hammer in and cause a ton of pain. Now, Deranged Hermit was also the core of a combo deck I played during the local Magic Arena season. As a predecessor to Friday Night Magic, Arena was the first chance for most Magic players to get foils. Anyway, between the 2 local gaming stores in my area, I went an astonishing 32-2 in matches in 6 weeks with Deranged Hermit and Baron, a Vanguard card that allowed me to sacrifice a permanent to bounce a creature to its owner's hand. And if you'd like to learn more about the Vanguard format, well, click over here to check out my profile on this format. I use this Baron Vanguard card with all sorts of 1/8/7 cards to get huge card advantage. I could cast Avalanche Riders again and again. I could cast Wall of Blossoms again and again, trading a permanent and 1G for a card. I could burn away problems with Gitu Slinger again and again. But the real nitro in the engine was Deranged Hermit, which allowed me to have lots of token creatures on the battlefield to spam against blockers and swing with my team, or tie up my opponent's mana production by forcing him to recast his creatures again and again. Forsyth used the Hermit as his finisher after using Plow Under and Avalanche Riders to decimate his opponent's mana base, thus giving that deck the name Angry Hermit. And yes, Deranged Hermit is the absolute best squirrel producer in all of Magic. Repopulate. Hey, it's ferrets, but not the type that do damage like in Homelands. And that's okay. This is certainly one of the cutest cards of all time, but Might of Oaks definitely gives it a run for its money in this set in the contest. One of my favorite cube cards is simple, clean, and elegant. Simian Grunt is one of the most powerful green removal spells there is, springing up a nasty block on unsuspecting players. This is way better than Odyssey's Elephant Ambush. Sorceries should not be called ambushes. I also prefer Simian Grunts to Odyssey's Beast Attack since, despite the Echo cost, it is cheaper. This was the first major flash creature in Limited and even saw a bit of constructed play. Mike Flores was an early proponent of the Grunts. I have a bit of claustrophobia, so if I feel uncomfortable talking about crawl space, please forgive me. This artifact wreaks havoc with anyone hoping to attack with swarms, and there's usually at least one of these people at most EDH tables. Silent Arbiter and Dueling Grounds possess very similar effects. Crawl space may be annoying, but it's far less so than its predecessor, Portcullis from Stronghold, which was endlessly annoying with limiting the number of creatures on the table entirely. Grim Monolith makes more mana than it costs to play. That's why it got banned very quickly. It's also an amazing combination with Saga's Voltaic Key. This makes it highly sought after by most Eternal and casual players. This shares a lineage with ABU's Mana Vault and Basalt Monolith, and it was the last mana rock printed for a long time that cost more than it produced. If you're a big fan of Devoid from Battle for Zendikar block, then you owe it to yourself to try out Thran Lens. This doesn't make any permanent artifacts, but does make them colorless. This was a great way for decks such as Red Deck Winds to deal with protection from a color, especially in an era where Circles of Protection saw play in sideboards. Let's take a short break to look at the top 10 most valuable cards from Urza's Legacy. Final verdict. Unsurprisingly, Urza's Legacy sits in the shadows cast by its predecessor, Urza Saga, a set that took the mana system and ran it through the ringer. And adding 2 more cards to the mix that got banned, one of them even before the set hit the street, did not help. Now, Wizards even made a card that effectively produced infinite mana after High Tide or lands that tap for multiple mana. That's playing with fire right there. Urza's Legacy also suffers because it doesn't have any new keywords, just iterations on pre-existing keywords such as Echo and ETB triggers. This is a lesson that Wizards did not learn from quickly, since the next block had no new official keywords and was wildly credited at the time as one of the weakest, least interesting blocks in Magic's history. I have a much kinder view on Mercadian Masks in the block, though. I suspect that one of the major reasons for a lack of new keywords or ability in Urza's Legacy or Destiny compared to the modern era was a hesitation to add new rules into the Magic rulebook that was included with starter decks. That rulebook did mention older rules without reminder text, like Banding and Rampage. With new mechanics introduced with every block and later every set, that would mean that the official Magic rules couldn't fit within the confines of a small card-sized 32-page booklet. Eventually, with the demise of the Duelist magazine and the release of Invasion heralding a stronger online presence and commitment to updating Wizards' website, the company was happy with the official version of the rules existing online instead of paper. And while the Magic rules documents can be a bit daunting to some, there are enough judges out there who are properly educated, and templating has improved, so that this isn't as much of an issue as it could have been. Anyway, I digress. Urza's Legacy also benefits from having fewer banned cards than Urza Saga. The attempt to make creatures more spell-like by adding ETB triggers on Echo creatures blurred the lines between creatures and non-creature spells to the game's credit. While Visions was the first expert-level set to do this, Urza's Legacy turned it up a notch and made Echo perform double duty with more interesting decisions, and so I have to admire that. Urza Saga creatures were particularly weak and small-statted, a return to pre-Tempest block stats that de-escalated aggressive strategies, and while Urza's Legacy didn't overturn Saga's push towards smaller creatures and more powerful non-creature spells, Urza's Legacy was the beginning of a turn in the right direction to restore the Golden Triangle. And so, with a -1 deduction for the free spells, Memory Jar, and Grim Monolith, Urza's Legacy earns a 6 out of 10, so pick up some singles, skim over the spoiler, and give some of these great cards a try. Next time, we're going to move ahead to Urza's Destiny. Of course, what do you expect? Urza's Destiny continued to feature powerful artifacts and misunderstood mechanics. But why was it so misunderstood? Stay tuned for next time. Be sure to like, subscribe if you haven't already, and leave a comment. It always makes my day when I see that red bell light up. Thanks for watching. This is Eli Kaplan, signing off for Ancestral Recall. Good games, and good luck.